very often, within, Muslim majority societies in the Middle East, they do not necessarily live in societies where there is, freedom of opinion. I mean, they live in sort of autocratic regimes where obviously, there are certain limitations and so on put by the political authorities in terms of what kind of discourse you can engage with and so on. But certainly for Muslim minorities living in Europe and North America, these kind of political constraints do not exist. And, within academic circles, outside of academic circles, there's quite a lot of debate. And, things are changing, things are adapted. And sometimes, I suppose, the changes are not seen, because they're very slow and very gradual.
There's the issue, of course, of Sharia law, and a lot of people are very fearful of the idea of Muslims becoming a majority in a state and then imposing what is seen as a very authoritarian regime on people who don't share the Islam faith. Abdullah, how do you respond to that?
You said it right. It is seen as an authoritarian system. However, Islam, we practice Sharia law 90% of it anyway. Living in the West or living in Saudi Arabia or anywhere in the world, we can practice 90% of the Sharia. The only thing is, in Ireland, for example, we can't practice is the capital punishments, for example. But other than that, we can practice, and we practice almost everything prescribed by the Sharia law. And once again, I mean, I would differ from Oliver. He was saying that Islam did spread within 100 years. That's true. The Arabs were the elites and so on. But there's an underlying principle, and that is there is no compulsion in religion. And that means that no one is forced to convert to Islam. And that is why it took a gradual process. In fact, in many parts of the world, Islam spread through trade and through interaction, through education and so on. And so Sharia law itself is a set of rules, a guidance, a set of guidelines through which we can conduct our lives, which is in accordance to the instructions of God and in peace, or what we believe is good for humanity.
That's a voluntary thing for you, but in some societies that have Muslim majorities, and they impose Sharia law on everybody, and that's seen as oppressive of people who don't share the Islamic faith.
True, I agree with that. There are certain places where Sharia law is implemented, not in the way that the Prophet would have implemented it, in a nice and gentle way, or the early generations would have implemented it. In certain places, people are forced to follow a certain thinking process, certain way of worshipping and so on. It is true, but at the same time, the spirit, you must understand there's a lot of times what is conflated, there's a conflation between religion and the actual religion and its teachings and culture. There's a lot of times where the religion itself has become the culture and the tradition of the people. So they pray and they fast and they implement the Sharia law, not knowing why they're doing it, not understanding the whole philosophy behind it, the purpose of praying and the purpose of fasting and giving in charity and so on. So it is done in a mechanical way, and that's when problems start happening. Having said that, in countries like Saudi Arabia, in the Middle East, for example, where it is supposed to be completely Sharia law, Christians, Muslims, Jews, atheists, Buddhists, Hindus live there, and they have their temples and their churches in designated areas, and it is, they carry on their worship or their activities as normal.
But nonetheless, Sharia law applies throughout the state. For instance, like the one that would gravely upset many Irish people, particularly Irish men, the ban on alcohol applies.
Of course, if I'm in Ireland, I have to follow the rules of Ireland. I mean, I can't, as I said, I can implement Sharia law. Irish constitution, Irish law does not prevent me from praying and fasting and giving in charity, and that's my 90% of my Sharia law. What but again, Islam teaches me to respect the laws of the country that where I'm living in. So therefore, I cannot come in here and start fighting for implementing the last 10% of the Sharia law.
The mention of charity reminds me that one of the pillars of Islam is almsgiving, which seems to me to be quite a regressive idea, but that the wealthy shall give some charity to the poor. Indeed, the present Pope Francis talks in similar terms, which goes against the idea of equality, that there's almost the inference that it's okay to have deeply unequal societies so long as there's a few pence thrown the
No, on the contrary, the Quran very clearly says that wealth has to be shared, pain has to be shared, the riches has to be shared, and it's not. The idea is not to maintain an unequal society. In Islamic history, if you look at the economic history of certain the empires and the caliphates, for example, in the Umayyad Caliphate, the difference between the poor and the rich was very little. And in fact, not only the rich are encouraged to donate, it's the poor as well can donate. And the donation, the whole ethos of charity is encouraged across the board, not just for the rich.
All right. One of the interesting features of Islam is the prohibition on usury interest, which runs quite contrary to the capitalist system. But I think there's been certain ingenuity in Islamic societies to get around that. Oliver, would you agree with that?
Yes, I suppose. I mean, there is quite a lot of debate, and I mean the term that is used in the Quran, riba, I mean, has various meanings. I mean, very often contemporary Muslims say, it means a general prohibition of taking interest. Others would say it's just a reference to usury, excessive interest and so on. I mean, the kind of idea of Islamic banking that has emerged, sort of a kind of capitalist banking system that is in accordance with the Sharia, is a rather modern phenomenon. I mean, the idea of Islamic banking only emerged in the 1930s in response to the emergence of sort of a capitalist banking system across the globe.
How did they get around the prohibition, the straightforward prohibition on usury?
Yes, I suppose some cynical people would say, I mean, there are obviously certain ethical implications. Obviously, alcohol is prohibited, so you can't have investment into, companies that produce alcohol or pork or pornography and these sort of things. So there's a kind of ethical dimension that any kind of company, business activity that is contrary to Islamic, moral principle is prohibited. Some cynics would say it's more or less a kind of semantic adjustment where you do sort of take interest, but you just don't call it interest.
You can't have banks without interest.
Yes.
And there are Islamic banks, so how do you get around? Do you want to further?
Yes, you can run a system, and Islamic societies before they were colonized, they had economic systems which ran pretty much very well, and economies fell and they rose up and they made money and they lost money. Islam sees interest as a very unfair and unjust system, where not only the person taking or paying, getting into a contract where he has to pay or she has to pay interest, it's unfair on them, but also it gets levied on the generations that are to come. We are seeing that example here in Ireland and in Europe, where tons of trillions of euros would be levied on the generations to come because of the debt crisis we have. And Islam encourages a system where people lend to each other on fair terms and encourages forgiveness of debt. It encourages enterprise and partnerships, and there are different forms of partnerships, different terms and conditions of partnerships on different products and different enterprises. So Islam has these guidelines for an economic system. However, in the modern world, obviously, we have to look at the whole situation that we are living in, the world as a global village, and obviously the system that we are living in is totally ingrained or totally rooted into a system which deals with interest on a regular basis. So the Muslim economists and thinkers are trying to think or coming up with ways that allow smaller enterprises, smaller activity, financial activity, take place without give and take of interest. And that's how Islamic banks